Welcome everyone to the Tippy webinar series. Thank you for joining us for our fourth presentation in our Workplace Wellbeing webinar series. My name is Ashley Durham and I am the Director of Alumni Engagement at the Tippy College of Business, and I'll be your moderator today. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and based on the U.S. Surgeon General's framework of workplace mental health and well-being, we have created a 5-part workplace well-being series where we will provide evidence-based tools for helping you be successful at work and help to promote employee well-being. This series is all in thanks to the research done by our own Tippy faculty. I would like to thank Stephen Courtwright and all the faculty from our Management and Entrepreneurship Department for their work on this series. It's always a pleasure to partner together to bring the knowledge of our faculty to our alumni and friends across the world. Today, I am excited to have Amy Colbert and Daniel Newton share their presentation entitled Mattering at Work, Engaging Workers in Workplace Decisions and Connecting Individual Work with Organizational Missions. Just some information before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type those into the Q&A box, not the chat, in your Zoom control panel, and we'll bring those up at the end of this session today and do a live Q&A. As a reminder, all of our virtual presentations are uploaded to the college's YouTube page with closed captioning following our live webinar event. Finally, you are encouraged to stay until the end of the webinar so that we can gather your thoughts on today's presentation. Your feedback helps make our virtual programming even better, so we appreciate you taking time to answer our 4-question survey at the end. Before we get going, I'd like to quickly introduce both Amy and Daniel. Amy Colbert is a professor of management and entrepreneurship in the Tippy College of Business, where she holds the Leonard A. Hadley Chair in Leadership. Amy's research focuses on the way in which individuals connect with their work, their coworkers, their supervisors, and their organizations in ways that motivate and sustain them. She also studies leaders, examining the factors that contribute to effective leadership and the mechanisms by which leaders achieve results. Finally, she is interested in how identity shapes beliefs and decisions. Daniel Newton is an assistant professor of management and entrepreneurship at the Tippy College of Business. Daniel's research focuses on the causes and consequences of speaking up at work and how employees invest their energies as they transition between work tasks. A recipient of an 8-year NASA grant, he has conducted research with astronauts aboard the International Space Station, isolated crews in Houston, and cosmonauts in the Mars training facility in Moscow. Prior to joining academia, Daniel worked in corporate finance and strategy at a Fortune 50 firm. Thank you both for being here, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and welcome to all of you. Amy and I are thrilled to share some of our thoughts on this topic, and would love to have a dialogue towards the end, and really hope you enjoy our time together. And so, as Ashley mentioned, May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And so Amy and I are going to talk about this bottom corner a little bit, mattering at work, and how we can help those around us as well as ourselves find meaning, feel dignified in our work. And I'll actually kind of loop in a lot. This middle section too about voice is where a lot of my research is, just because that's an important part of people feeling dignified. And so to start out, maybe a question is, like, how can we create dignity with other people through voice? Is there a way that we can give people kind of a seat at the table, to involve them, to let them know kind of that they matter, that their voice is heard? And just to define what voice is the expression of new ideas or even problems, but these are shared with the intent to kind of facilitate improvements at work, to improve the work practices, the methods, the way things are done. And again, as I said earlier, it's really giving people a seat at the table. So when you speak up, or when somebody around you speaks up, having that voice heard shows that they matter and shows that kind of their input is valuable too. And we can talk about, are there ways to kind of politely decline voice, because we can't always do everything at work, but just really getting people's perspective and involvement through hearing what they're thinking is really important to them feeling dignity in their work. Now, why does voice matter? I love this quote from George Bernard Shaw. It's from his play Mrs. Warren's Profession, where he said that people are always blaming their circumstances for what they are. I don't believe in circumstances. The people who get on in this world are the people who get up and look for the circumstances they want. If they can't find them, they make them. Meaning voice helps us be in the driver's seat at work, that if things aren't perfect, we should say something about it to kind of initiate a process of constructive change. And again, voice is the mechanism that allows us to be champions for this positive change. So why does voice matter? Well, at the company level, and if you think about as the frontline employees or managers, as people are speaking up, why does this matter? Well, it helps companies be more creative, helps them learn where they're sharing information, and they're kind of more effective because they're putting into practice optimized work processes. And so there's a number of different studies that have highlighted this. So improve financial performance, improve sales, reduce turnover because people feel like they belong more. All of these things kind of signal the value of voice for companies. What about for employees? So some research that I've conducted, when people speak up, they're actually seen as better performers. So Amy is a great example of someone that speaks up, isn't shy of sharing her opinion. And that's why Amy's such a high performer. Because if you think about it, take a step back, if people suggest new ideas, new perspectives, something that I found in my research is that people see those individuals as more competent, more reputable. They trust them more. And there's different ways to speak up. So if I speak up and Amy says, hey, Daniel, great idea, I feel that support, that encouragement, and then I want to be on a team with Amy because she's likable, she's warm and friendly, right? Does that kind of ring true?
That rings true. That's our dynamic.
And so voice is important not only for companies and organizations, but also just for individuals, right? When they speak up. So here's the million-dollar question. Why is speaking up so hard?
I think that's such a good question because even as someone, I've been at the Tippie College of Business for 16 years now. I care a lot about this place, but there are times when I just feel overwhelmed. I've got all of my own stuff going on. And so speaking up to make the organization better, to suggest something for the department, sometimes means that it's going to land back on my plate.
Yeah.
But even if it's not, just finding the time to make that entree into another realm versus keeping my head down and getting my stuff done, that's a balancing act.
That's a great point, because sometimes when we speak up, it may be outside of our comfort zone or maybe outside of our job, and maybe we're not looking for more work. And so there can be some benefits of just staying silent, right? Because then we can just do really well at our job. And I think there's some other reasons too, potentially. And I don't know if any of you have felt this way, but we don't want to look stupid. We don't want to say something that maybe we don't know everything about that specific process. Maybe there's another expert in the company. If there is something worth changing here, surely this person would say something. And so we don't want to stick our neck out. Maybe we don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to say, hey, boss, this idea that you put into practice isn't really going well. I have a better way of doing it, because we're challenging that person. And maybe we don't want to rock the boat. We want to keep things steady. And we may not feel psychologically safe. We'll circle back to what that term is in a little bit, or maybe how we can encourage psychological safety. But psychological safety in a nutshell is being able to freely speak up without it being held against you. And maybe we think things are futile, that nothing's going to change. Why should I say something that's not going to change anyway? Or maybe we don't think our ideas are good enough. And so I'll try to kind of hit on a few of these different points, and Amy will provide some color commentary just about maybe ways that we can overcome some of these hurdles that we experience in speaking up. So the first one is one that Amy mentioned, which is a paper that I just published, and it's one of my favorite projects, which is, and maybe this has happened to you, where you speak up and your boss says, hey, great idea, go run with that. And you're like, really? You feel kind of deflated, and because it just means more work for you. And so what we found is that as people speak up, if supervisors kind of toss that hot potato back to the employee felt overloaded, and then they felt regret for having spoken up. And so you can imagine they stayed silent in the future, because they're calculating in their mind, is it worth really speaking up in this? Because I know I'm going to be asked to do more work. Now, what we found that's super interesting is that maybe how this voice is delegated to the employee matters. So supervisors just said, you're on your own, essentially, good luck with this. that kind of led to the most overload. Whereas if supervisor said, do you know what, great idea, I'm going to be in the trenches with you. I'm going to kind of be involved, be here as a sounding board for you, and we can kind of walk through this process together. People were less overloaded, right? And so they experienced less regret. And so these negative effects were minimized. So if you do need to delegate something, how you delegate it matters.
I think that's so important too. Delegation is one of those balancing acts, right? That you want to give people power to run with ideas, but that being there with them in the trenches. When I teach about remote supervision, I talk about checking in, not checking up on people, right? So being there, being supportive, but also giving people some power to run with the idea.
And a word that you said twice, Amy, just barely, was the word power. And that kind of ties into a separate study that I did that looked at like delegation done right. It facilitates voice because it empowers people, right? You're involving them in the process. You're giving them a voice. So let's say that it's like setting goals for the year, and we're beyond kind of annual goal setting periods, but like not just saying these are your assigned goals, good luck, but saying what do you think, like, and then involving them, and then that empowers people, and then they want to speak up because they have something to say. They feel like it's going to make a difference, this sense of impact and kind of meaning. And I know that we'll kind of circle back to some of those things, but it's totally that power piece, right? They feel psychologically empowered, and so I think that's really important. Oops, went the wrong way. And so in general, here's some study that I did, and you'll see that there's links at the bottom if you want to look at those, or if you have questions, we can talk offline later. But really, how can we create opportunities for people to speak up? One is like personality factors. And there's just some dispositional characteristics that predict people who are more or less likely to speak up. So for example, some people tend to be more extroverted than others. And those extroverts are more likely to speak up more frequently. Or some people tend to take more initiative than others, and those people are more likely to speak up. So there may not be a lot that we can do on that front, but these others, I think there are. So if people feel like accountable, if they feel this sense of responsibility, that's going to motivate them to want to say something, where it's like, do you know what? I care about this organization. I feel this sense of ownership. And that's going to encourage them to want to say something. And I'll come back to that here in a little bit about a study I'm conducting now. Psychological safety, though, is huge. People feeling like it's a safe space where they can speak up and it's not going to be held against them. And then finally, if you have an open leader who's, an open door policy, but not just that, a policy, but an open door practice where it's like, I really want your opinion, your perspective. Please say something. Let me hear what you're thinking. And so any of these, Amy, that you want to kind of just thoughts on, like ways that maybe kind of organizations or people can create an environment of psychological safety, or leaders can be more open? Because Amy used to be my boss. She's not anymore, but her door, she was like the epitome of the open door policy. And maybe it was, you can't see it, the chocolate that she had, that she would lure people in, but she was a great kind of sounding board for individuals. So like, what's the secret sauce for you?
Yes, so chocolate helps,
Okay.
right? So open door, but then just being curious. I think curiosity is an underrated leadership trait, right? And so always being curious about other people's perspectives on how to do things better. But here's one I struggled with early on as a leader. I felt like if people gave me an idea and I wasn't able to necessarily implement or act on it, that they weren't going to come back to me, right? And so it's like, do I have to implement everything that people bring to me? Impossible.
Exactly.
But this idea of circling back and letting people know, I really valued that input. Here's the decision that was made, and it went a different direction, but just closing that loop made people more likely to come back the next time and give some feedback.
I think that's huge, because then it's like, then the individual employee knows that their voice isn't just going into a black hole that it's never going to emerge out of.
Yeah.
To say, hey, we couldn't do this for these reasons, X, Y, and Z, but keep them coming. I want to hear from you.
Mm-hmm.
I really like that. And so those are some, hopefully some practical tips. So keep chocolate in your office and kind of encourage curiosity, or be curious yourself.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid of some of these things. And now there could be potential reasons to be afraid, which I'll talk about, but I think this could help you position how you speak up. And so what I'm trying to kind of show here with these images is that when we speak up as individuals, kind of typically it depends on how we frame things. And that will depend on the emotions that we feel and then the behaviors that we enact. So on one hand, if we speak up with new ideas, where it's, hey, I have this new and creative suggestion, that evokes this top path where we feel this sense of pride, where we're happy. We feel this sense of self-assurance, like we're making a difference. And then that leads us to kind of engage more with the people around us. We want to kind of help other people. We want to seek that interpersonal connection with others at work. On the flip side, on the other hand, if we speak up about problems, then that tends to evoke a sense of anxiety, where I'm feeling kind of torn up inside. And so that's the person with his hair in his on his head, but then it just keeps getting worse, where we're like, we tend to not only feel that anxiety, but then we withdraw, and we're kind of less likely to kind of connect with other people. And supervisors, sorry, I keep going the wrong way. Supervisors feel this as well, where let's say that I speak up to Amy with a new idea, she's going to feel good. It promotes your well-being because you're like, whoa, let's think about these new opportunities, these new possibilities, because she's such a curious person. But if I speak up to my boss with a problem, that may hinder their well-being, especially if they feel powerless to do anything, where it's like, I can't help you. And now kind of I'm carrying your burden too. And so I think how we pitch things matters. Now, sometimes it's okay to pitch problems as problems because it kind of elicits a sense of urgency, but just be aware of that, how we convey that kind of affects our emotions and others' kind of emotional responses too.
So can I ask you a question about
Sure.
that one? Because I was having a conversation with a colleague, and advice that we often hear, especially for new employees, is don't bring me a problem, bring me a solution, right?
Exactly.
But not always, as a new employee, do you have the context to develop the solution.
Yeah.
Sometimes the best you can do is raise the problem. Are there ways to do that are more positive, that result in less of the hair in the hands?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And so I would say if you are communicating a problem, again, like if closing the loop, as you talked about before, giving more context proactively, like I've tried to think of solutions and I can't, or this is what I thought about, but it doesn't seem valuable. And so can you help me think through this issue? And like maybe being willing to be part of the solution could be part of that too. And I think a study I'm doing right now, this isn't in the slides, but maybe you could frame it as a question. I just used the word maybe, and so you could soften it. Like, have we thought about this? Or it seems like this could be an issue, maybe a way to soften the response, and just so people don't feel so challenged. And actually, instead, again, this term power, when we frame things as questions as opposed to direct statements, people feel empowered in taking that. So that could be a solution potentially. If pitching a problem, frame it in a question. So maybe those are some things that you can think about and that help. Finally, I mentioned this notion of like felt responsibility. If you feel accountable, if you feel kind of connected with the idea that you have, finding sounding boards that you can run these by. And so they may be people like Amy, good coworkers that you know are going to be warm and receptive and kind of help you think through these. This context, the study that we're running right now, was actually at home. So if you speak up to a spouse or a partner, that can give you this sense of commitment where you're like, oh, this is a good idea. As they vouch for you and say, this is a legitimate idea, then that's going to motivate you to speak up at work because you think it's higher quality, and then you're more committed and attached to that. And so that's just kind of a fun little study that we're running right now. And so I think this would apply to coworkers though, not just, so finding sounding boards, not at work, but also at work that you can run things by. And maybe that will satisfy your sense of feeling heard, but I think it also can help you kind of get more motivated for the ideas that you have before you share them with your boss. Now, finally, some people may still feel uncomfortable speaking up. And so I think an opportunity, and these could be about mental health or other things. A doctoral student here at Tippy is doing his dissertation on just this, speaking up about mental health. And some individuals may be a little tentative doing so. And so I think an opportunity that we all have is to be advocates, is to advocate for other people who that you notice may not speak up, to say, hey, can I kind of, as you'll see this Latin derivation, can I voice or plead on your behalf? Or, I mean, being an ally where you're kind of bound to somebody else and you're connecting with them. And so connecting with other people, helping, kind of putting yourself in their shoes to speak up for them and to assist them, I think can be a valuable behavior that we can all enact. So
I like that so much because, as I said, I've been here a long time and I'm at the stage of my career where I feel like I can often speak up without a lot of ramifications.
yeah,
Whereas newer employees,
people like me,
people like you, also can speak up because you have great ideas, but might run that through someone else.
exactly.
And I think that's a good strategy because some of you may be thinking, I'm nervous about speaking up. It seems like it would be a way for me to contribute, but what about that potential backlash? And working with someone who has been around a little bit and can advocate for your idea is one way to do that.
I love that. And so if you seek out a sounding board or an ally or an advocate, something that person can do is like amplify your voice. And so if you say something that they can say, great idea, Daniel, I think that's really important. And that creates some positive momentum and some additional social capital that captures other people's attention. So I think that's a really important role, is to just get other people involved in the speaking up process. So Amy, let's keep going. I think it's on to you.
I want to talk a little bit about finding meaning in your work, because I think that's the other dimension as we think about what makes you feel like you matter at work.
Yeah.
Being heard, right? Speaking up, that promotes that sense of dignity that Daniel talked about. But I have done a lot of research on people who really feel as though their work is meaningful. It's an important part of who they are. Perhaps the work they do is particularly significant in a number of ways, and we'll talk about that. Or they work for an organization that really focuses on the purpose of the organization and the value that it adds to society. Maybe it's just the ways that people interact with others at work that make them find meaning. But I'm always really curious about people who are able to find meaning in their work. And my curiosity of this started probably somewhere back on this shelf. You can find Studs Terkel's book, Working. Studs Terkel is a sociologist, and there's actually a new Netflix series out about his book that just dropped. So you can go and get the update on this. He simply talked to people about their work. He talked to people who worked in all kinds of jobs, in all kinds of industries, and he came up with a lot of insights simply from this kind of qualitative research, which is something that I do too. One of the most impactful things that Studs Terkel said after interviewing a number of people in a number of different kinds of jobs was that he found that people talked about their work. It was a search for daily meaning as well as daily bread, for recognition as well as for cash. I love this part, for astonishment rather than torpor. Sometimes I think astonishment is a lot to ask of our work, maybe not every day, but having that sort of life rather than a Monday through Friday sort of dying. Those are very opposite ends of the continuum, right? But when people are able to find that sort of meaning in their work, it does give them the sense that they matter, and it promotes positive well-being. And so what I want to talk about for a few minutes are a few research studies that I've done on what makes work meaningful. And there's lots of different answers to how do we find meaning in our work. Daniel, I'm curious for you. What makes your work meaningful? Do you find meaning in your work?
Absolutely. And I think some of it, Amy, to this picture is not just cooking with carrots, you know what I mean? But having all the vegetables, having the tomatoes, the cucumbers, the squash, and the carrots. So mixing it up, not just doing the same thing over and over. And so I love conducting research. But I love being in the classroom too. I love connecting with all of you over the webinar. So just doing different things, I think, is really valuable.
Yes. I love that. And sometimes people have routine jobs where their work is fairly similar day to day, but organizations think about ways to enrich that.
Yeah.
I worked with a hospital when I was at the University of Notre Dame, a hospital in South Bend, Indiana, and every single employee went through a week of innovation training. And I talked to one of their public safety officers, and their public safety officers had a fairly routine job day to day, but then they got this week to go, how can we make things better? And it actually came up with a project where they painted all the fire hydrants near the children's hospital to look like different characters. And then they got to enact that, right? And they were given the time to do that. And as this person told me the story, I could tell they told it to lots of people. They'd gone home and told their families, right? They'd gone out and into their communities and been like, you see those fire hydrants downtown? I did that. So finding that way to mix things up, even if work is routine, is a really good way to do that. I'm going to talk about 4 main principles to make work more meaningful. I'm going to talk about, first of all, finding work that's consistent with your values and your identity. Do you get to live out who you are at work? That's a way to find meaning. I'm going to talk about a lot of research that has shown when we have a positive impact on others, that makes us feel as though our work is more meaningful and adds to our own well-being. I'll talk a little bit about this belonging to a purpose-driven organization. What if your work is routine, but you can connect it to that organizational mission? And then I'm going to tell a story about my mom, which really brings us to how to work in ways that allow you to make a difference, again, even if your work tends to be rather routine. So let's start with, how do you find meaningful work? I mentioned I do both quantitative and qualitative research, but this study was a large-scale qualitative study that I did with my colleague Matt Bloom at the University of Notre Dame and Jordan Nielsen, who was a PhD student here at Tempe at the time. He's now at Purdue University. The people who published our research study, which is always a little bit long and dense, also did a lovely little blog post about our findings. So there's a QR code there. If you scan it, it'll take you to the blog post that gives you just a little bit more information about what we found.
QR codes, you're fancy.
QR codes. This is your indication that my college-age kids are home for our summer vacation. So making QR codes is something that I can delegate. The QR code gives you a little bit of insight into what was a huge study. We interviewed over 200 people, doctors, teachers, relief service workers, pastors, people who described their work not only as meaningful, but would even go so far to say, I felt called to do this work. And one of the things we were really interested in was, how do people find their callings? I work with a lot of undergraduates who are thinking, what am I going to do next? How do I find that really meaningful work? And for many of us, we think that people who find a calling knew it all along. There are those people out there. We call them the discerners. Discerners think a lot about their individual values, their strengths, their personality traits. They do this introspection, and then they're very attuned to the people around them who might be doing work that allows them to live out those values or to demonstrate those personality traits, to use those strengths. When they find those exemplars, when they find people who are doing that kind of work that they can see themselves in, they are able to jump right into a career that they find meaningful. So we had doctors who said, you know what, my mom always said, I can see you doing this. You're good at science, but you're also good with people. And so I can see how this happens. Discerners oftentimes had a little help. We called those people wise guides, people who said, I see this in you. But ultimately, they were able to do work in their heads to figure out what would be meaningful for them. And they found that fit, that match. I think alignment is so important here. Not everybody, though. What if you're one of those people who's like, yeah, I'm on my 3rd job and I really haven't found it yet. Maybe it's just not meant to be. Maybe I'll never find meaning in my work. My husband fits in this category. He did a lot of different things, sold furniture, did blinds and shades, and eventually was always a little bit disconcerted. There wasn't that alignment. Something was missing. And he would describe it as, I just don't really love what I'm doing. I don't feel like it's really me. And so explorers are people who don't always know right from the beginning, but cast around and continue to look for that work that they love. Where is it that I can do something that allows me to live out those values and that allows me to really find meaning in my work because I'm able to do that? Are you a discerner or an explorer?
I would say I'm probably an explorer. I don't know. I mean, that's like with my prior career, it's like, I want to do this. Nope, I don't. And I want to do this. No, I don't. And so I think sometimes those dead ends, at least for me, were helpful. And it's just, I guess, part of the journey, right?
Yes. You don't always know, right?
Yeah.
What's going to be the thing that, again, it clicks, it aligns, it fits well for you. And then when you find it, for our
Exactly.
explorers, they also said, you know what, this is my calling. I didn't know it from the very beginning, but I finally found it. That wasn't the end of the story, though. So our interviewees said, yep, I did. And I started, but there wasn't always that sense that I've got this perfect fit. I had to do some work to really create or craft what I was doing so that it fit even better. And I think that this is important because no matter what job you're in, you may be able to do things that allow you to find more meaning, no matter where you've ended up, what kinds of jobs you chose. Our interviewees told us 3 things that they did. One was because they felt called to do this work, because they felt connected to the profession, they wanted to be seen as a legitimate member of the profession. They really wanted to be someone who, our pastors would say, my congregant came to me and said, you're my priest now, you're my pastor, you're the person I turn to for guidance. And so they did a lot of work to build legitimacy. I feel like we do this in our job and I'm never going to be done, right? I want to be a good professor. And so whatever's coming down the pike, I'm going to figure out how to do it well. That's going to allow me to find more meaning in my work. We also found that people said, it's not just about me changing to meet the profession and its needs, it's about me crafting what I do to be authentic. So again, a pastor who was very committed to environmental movements talked about doing a sermon series on how to take care of the earth. I talked to a teacher who was great at technology and became everyone's go-to for technological services. One of our relief service workers would talk about being the person that when everybody else felt a little bit weighed down by their work, they would be the person who could be kind of the therapist to their colleagues. So how do you find the way to do your work that allows you to be more you? It takes some self-introspection, but it also takes some crafting, some thinking about your day-to-day, and what do you do to find those ways to make your mark on the work that you do. And then finally, I don't think I've ever given a presentation without talking about celebration. I'm a big fan. I think it fits everything, celebrating progress. We don't always realize that we're having an impact because as soon as we finish something, as soon as we make a difference, we're on to the next thing, or we're thinking about how could I have done that better. And so I'm a big believer in, I don't just keep a to-do list, I keep a done list, right? The end of every month, what did I get done? What actually happened that I can celebrate and feel good about? I still make my kids, now that they're back around the dinner table, what did you do today, right? What happened that made an impact on somebody else? And so the celebrating progress. So this is my way of saying that finding a calling is a piece of the puzzle, but it's only the beginning, that every day we have the opportunity to make decisions that allow us to find more meaning in our work.
And that's so interesting, Amy, because like some of my research with NASA looked at like the daily tasks that crew members were doing to find meaningfulness. And so we looked at if you start your day, if crew members started their day with the most meaning, or should they end their day with the most meaning, or cluster the meaning in the middle of the day. And what we found is, at least preliminarily, is that starting your day with the most meaningful was the best, because it creates this roller coaster of sorts where you can ride the positive momentum, where you start your day feeling good, and then that can carry over into what you do after that.
Yeah.
And so don't like postpone the meaningful tasks that you haven't done. I'll do those later. You know, I mean, I'll just do the mundane. No, do the things that are most enjoyable and most meaningful first, is what we're finding.
Oh, I love that. So the sequencing matters. I think that's so important. I also think that it's important, though, to realize sometimes when I tell this story, I can picture all of you, although I don't get you on my screen in a webinar, I can picture all of you going, yes, but there can be challenges to that. And I am currently doing a research study. It's another interview study. And if any of you are in a situation where you're dealing with changes to the meaning in your work, I'd love to talk to you. My email will be at the end of the presentation and you should reach out. But this is a study that's really, in some ways, pretty personal to me. I had a plan for being a meaningful contributor at work. I was the department head. I thought a little bit about what's next. Maybe I become a provost, which is the head of the academic part of a university. Maybe I become the head of faculty development because that is work I love. And then I had a health diagnosis that changed what I was going to be able to do. And it felt as though it was a little bit of an off-ramp. Okay, maybe I have to give up this idea that my plan isn't going to work. And I think that what I'm hoping to get at for my next research study is the way that people navigate those changes. And there are a lot of great stories out there about people who experienced a transition, thought that was the end, but really this quote from Maggie Smith, who has a new book out that I love, she's a poet, so her way with words is so nice. She said, I thought what I was living was the whole story, but it was only a chapter. And there's another chapter behind that. So how do you, when something happens that disrupts the meaning you find in your work, how do you pivot and find more meaning? One of the most interesting studies that I've seen come out so far about this, a colleague of mine at Yale University studies journalists. And there's a big change to the way that newspaper people, right, who used to really go out and doggedly pursue a story, the way that the news gets reported and researched has changed a lot. And for many of those people, it felt like the end to what they found real meaning in. And she studies how do they make a pivot so that they can continue to find meaning in that work.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in those stories of change and navigation, because it's not always a straight road. As somebody who has off-roaded in Jeeps before, this muddy picture, I think, tells a story. So a couple of other ideas before we go to your questions, and please, if you have questions, feel free to start putting them in the Q&A. Ashley's going to help us moderate those at the end. So if you have questions about what Daniel and I are talking about, please feel free to post them. But I want to give you a couple of strategies for reminding yourself about the impact that you're having on others. And one of these comes from a whole series of research studies done by researchers across the country that has found a very consistent finding. If we are aware of the positive impact that we have on others, if we are attuned to our positive interactions with the people who benefit from our work, we're much more likely to be motivated. This is because it reminds us of that positive impact, but it also makes us more committed to our work. We see the positive outcomes that can come. And both of those, that sense of impact, so the cognition and the emotion of being affectively committed, make us more motivated. This happens for people who are always with their beneficiaries. So when I did my interview study with doctors and teachers and pastors, they were constantly getting feedback from the people who benefited from their work. But a colleague of mine, Adam Grant at the University of Pennsylvania, has done work on call center employees. Not the most motivating job, right? You sit in a call center. These folks worked for a university, so trying to get donations for scholarships. And they did a very simple experiment. They brought in a scholarship recipient to meet with half of the call center employees. And the scholarship recipient told them about what an impact having that scholarship had had on their ability to complete their schooling, how it had really changed their lives. The other half of the call center employees didn't have that brief encounter. And it was a brief encounter. Yet a month later, there was still an impact of that encounter in that people who had met with the scholarship recipient were spending more time on the phones and were collecting more money as well. So hard dollar outcomes that resulted from that positive beneficiary interaction. So if you have the chance to connect with people who benefit from your work, Medtronic is an organization that does this really well. They make medical devices. And they bring in people who have had the benefit of using these devices to their annual meetings. People who work in the factory, who are in accounting for Medtronic, aren't ever going to meet these people otherwise. But Medtronic makes a point of bringing them in so that people can see there's something that I'm doing that's having an impact. If companies can do this, connecting people with their beneficiaries, they'll see an increase in the meaning that people find in their work. And so I love that story. There's ways to magnify that. You can savor these positive beneficiary interactions. I like to sit down at the end of the day when I'm looking at my done list and also think about wow, I'm really grateful that I had this opportunity. I like to share those with other people. And again, we come to the celebrating, big fan of
So
celebration.
get some mileage out of the positive interactions or the meaningfulness.
Yeah, absolutely.
So sometimes I think we get feedback, it's good, and we're like, great, move on, right? Let's like celebrating the wins.
Yeah, celebrating and savoring those wins. I think that's so important. However, I'm guessing this happens to you too. Daniel and I get to spend lots of time with some of our beneficiaries, the students that are in our classrooms. We get feedback from them at the end of the semester. Do you spend a lot of time savoring your positive comments?
Absolutely.
Really?
Well, I mean, more than the negative.
Yeah.
Because I mean, so there's research that like bad is stronger than good, meaning like we tend to kind of focus or fixate on the negative things that happen with us. And so I try to, I mean, take them equally, but remember, you know what I mean? Sometimes it's the vast majority, which is positive, and it's just a little bit that's negative, and we focus or fixate on that. And so
Yeah.
I do try to minimize the negative if possible.
See, and I think that's really smart. Sometimes I have even had my husband, who also teaches at the college, read my comments and just tell me the positive ones first so that I get that, right, as the kind of cushion for the negative. But again, those negative, your bad is stronger than good is exactly right. Those negative feedback moments stay with us longer. And we know that they happen too, especially in jobs that are what my colleague Jordan Nielsen and I call relationally rich, where you're day-to-day interacting with patients or students or consumers of any sort that you have that face-to-face interaction with. It's not always sunny in relationally rich jobs, was Jordan's great title for a study that we published last year. And again, there's a great little summary of that study that you can access through the QR code. But Jordan was interested in, for his dissertation research, understanding what happens when you have those negative beneficiary interactions. He studied nurses and times when patients were disrespectful or difficult to help. Sometimes they were aggressive or rude. There were oftentimes good reasons for this. We could understand why people in a difficult health situation might react negatively, but we were concerned about the impact that it was going to have on nurses. We felt like we wanted to understand both the positive and negative interactions and the effects that they had on the nurses' perceived social worth. So did they feel valued by patients and families, but also their perceived self-sacrifice? Were they in some situations able to frame negative interactions in ways that were, I'm foregoing my own self-interest. This isn't positive for me in the moment, but I have to do this because I'm trying to promote long-term well-being. And what we found is those positive interactions, just like all the other studies, yes, I feel really good. I feel valued. I have more meaning in my work when those things happen. But when there were negative interactions, there was a slight decrease in their perceived social worth. They felt as though they weren't being valued in the moment by patients and families, but they were able to reframe that as this is a part of the job, self-sacrifice. And they were especially able to do that reframing when they worked in a supportive unit, when we had people who were in this together. So it's not always sunny in relationally rich work. We do sometimes have those positive beneficiary interactions that increase our self-worth, but we can also have negative interactions that reduce our value. We don't feel as meaningful in that moment, but if we can reframe in ways that promote the idea that this is a part of the work that I'm doing. And one of my best friends is a fourth grade teacher. Fourth graders are not always going to be grateful and respectful. Sometimes not. But at the end of the day, I'm working with a team of people and I believe in what I do. And that was really the conclusion we drew from that study. I know we're starting to get some questions in. I'm excited about that. So I'm going to go very quickly through my last 2 points. Another way, what if you're doing work that is somewhat routine? Another way to find meaning is to connect with the purpose of your organization. And some leaders do this really well. There was a study of housekeepers at a hospital who found that they could connect the work that the housekeepers were doing and help them understand how that supported their mission. This is one specific health system, University of California in San Francisco, who said, we're going to be innovative, we're going to be high quality and cost competitive, we're going to deliver an unparalleled patient experience. If you're a doctor, you can see yourself in that. You're a nurse, absolutely. Housekeepers, for sure. The patient experience depends on that. The quality of the care depends on that. And so connecting people with the organization's mission can be a way to make sure that everyone sees the value in what they're doing.
There was a similar study by Drew Carden at Wharton who looked at with NASA.
Oh,
in,
yeah.
in the 60s, where I mean, talking to like a janitor, it's like, and we're a very mundane job potentially. It's like, no, I'm putting people on the move.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
You're connecting it to that larger mission. And
Yeah. When I did orientation, my first job, my first academic job at the University of Notre Dame, they had a groundskeeper come in, and he had worked there for 30 years, and he talked passionately about
he knew
was
Rudy
there.
probably.
He probably knew Rudy. He was like, he felt like he was making the experience for students, families, and alumni better.
Yeah.
And he talked about that. It was so powerful. Sometimes our missions are not specific enough to make us find that real strong meaning and value. And so it might be a specific strategic objective that you connect to. There's a book about change by Chip and Dan Heath called Switch. And they give this example about a unit at the University of California, San Francisco Health System that had an objective that they were going to be able to bring people in for breast care screenings for mammograms. And if there was a problem, in one day, they were going to be able to find give them the prognosis.
Wow.
There wasn't going to be come back in 3 weeks.
Then you're worrying for a long time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Took a lot of breaking down of silos, but they were able to do that. And so the people who worked there were like, yeah, we're the people that are keeping you from having that 3 weeks of worry. Amazing. The last point that I want to make, and as I mentioned, this is sort of inspired by my mom. My mom worked as a bookkeeper at a lumber yard, and it was fairly routine work. She went back to work after my brother and I were in middle school and old enough not to damage things too badly. And so she found a job in our small rural town that gave her an income. It was a job. And so you might say, yeah, she didn't really have the chance for this sort of meaning at work. But the way that my mom approached work was that she was going to be the person in the office who supported others. She was a little older because she'd taken time off. And so she worked with a lot of people who were 10 or 15 years younger than she was. And she was the person people came to with their problems. And as she would talk about her work, it was that connection. It was that way of being that allowed her to say, no, I'm not just going to work for a paycheck. You know, there's Vicky and there's Nancy and I'm connected with these folks after all these years because she became the person who took care of others. Maybe it's you're the person who solves problems well. Maybe it's whatever it is that's your strength. If you can bring that into the workplace, even if it's not your core job, you will have that sense of making a difference at work. So I think that's important because there are ways to find meaning, not just in what we do, but in how we do it as well. Yeah. So we want to leave time for your questions and comments. And I think Ashley's going to come back on and help us with this. We're going to stop sharing because you want to see our faces big on the screen. Perhaps, I don't know, we'll see. But Ashley, what kind of questions are we getting?
We are getting some amazing questions. So let's just jump right in. How can you start trusting supervisors and leadership again when you've spoken up and it was used against you?
Ooh, that's tricky. I think one thing to do is, if you can, have an honest conversation with your supervisor to say where you can give a specific instance and then the impact of that. Just because I think they need to know. And so not in general, like, I don't feel comfortable, but like, no, I spoke up and you kind of stole my idea and it made me not want to speak up in the future. So if you can, have an honest conversation. I'm doing a study with a doctoral student here, just starting one, like if supervisors steal employees' ideas, right? You speak up and then they claim it as their own. Employees don't, we tend not to like that, right? And so you tend to get a little aggressive and so kind of just confronting the supervisor if you can. If it doesn't go well, or if you can't, finding other people that can amplify your voice, or maybe there's different targets, mentors in the company that can help your ideas get heard. I think just choosing different voice channels potentially could be other options. So I don't know if there's anything you'd add to that or.
No, I do think as an employee, if you're in that situation, you are going to probably protect yourself a little bit when you speak up again. And so it may be that you speak up with a partner,
Yeah.
right? This idea of finding a sounding board and then speaking up together to remove a little bit of that risk from you is another strategy you might use in that situation.
I mean, I used to have a boss and we used to actually coordinate this where he's like, you send the email and we kind of talked about it and then I'll respond within a minute. Great idea, love it, blah, blah, blah. And so you create this little band, not to pressure other people, but just to show like the social support for it.
Yeah.
How can we create opportunities for voice for our remote colleagues?
It's another good question. You want me to go first?
You go first.
So an incoming doctoral student and I are trying to start to examine this. And so I don't know what the exact answer yet is on this yet, because we haven't kind of completed the study or even started it. But I would guess it's harder for people to speak up remotely just because there's additional barriers. They don't see people around the water cooler. There's fewer opportunities. So doing all you can to create more opportunities. Maybe it's one-on-one with these individuals where it's, and these could be daily check-ins, just on Slack. How are you doing? What's on your mind? How can I help? But just creating more touch points with those people, I think will naturally create more opportunities because they will feel more isolated because they're not in the office. So they don't have these kind of natural touch points that other employees might have.
Yeah, and it can be hard with remote employees to even know how are they doing. I've got a colleague who does a pulse survey at the beginning of each of their remote meetings. So once a week, I mean, even as frequently as that, a simple faces scale from really frowny to really smiley, right? And everybody weighs in, I'm really frowny today. And if you start to see that skewing down, that can be a good opener for a conversation of, okay, where's your pain point? What's going on? And now perhaps we can address that. And so it's really twofold benefit, knowing how people are doing, but also encouraging voice to change that trajectory as well.
And I think the closing the loop that Amy talked about earlier is also important with remote employees. So if they say something to you, don't just ignore the email and file it, but circle back, respond, let them know that kind of you heard them and that you're doing what you can with their suggestion.
Let's see. Another good one is, what should leaders do to help employees reframe negative interactions if that is a struggle for them? So what should leaders do to help employees reframe negative interactions if that is a struggle for them to do that on their own?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do think sometimes this requires somebody outside of your own head to reframe these things, right? That it's easy for us to see the negative in an interaction, perhaps because we are attuned to those negative pieces of feedback. And so I do think that reframing has to be done carefully because you don't want to deny the person's experience. This was a hard and difficult, and I'm struggling right now. Absolutely. And what can we do to fix this? And where's the next step? And so I think that kind of turning constructively to what can we do has to follow an empathetic perspective taking of, I understand this is a difficult situation. So I like to pair those two together. I got in a great discussion in the class. I teach an MBA class on leadership about how do we time those pivots. Right. And some leaders struggle because they'll spend too long in the sort of negative space with the employee and it's hard to pivot back out. Some leaders pivot so quickly that the employee doesn't feel heard. And so it's another one of those balancing acts of timing that pivot. I think. What would you say to that?
I totally agree. I wouldn't add anything.
I love the use of and instead of but.
It's true.
Yep. It makes a huge difference.
How can we encourage new employees to speak up how can we encourage new employees to speak up when we are not their direct supervisor?
I guess that's me.
I love that.
So first, I think let's think about like encouraging new employees to speak up. So I ran a study with sales agents in the US and then new employees, engineers in China. And what we found is that there's kind of two things that can happen. One is if the new employees speak up, giving them feedback, helping them to feel heard. So responding, listening is critical, and then continuing to speak up. And so they need to have individuals that are kind of on their team, even if you're not their direct supervisor. But what we also found is that there's supervisors that solicit voice, that say, hey, let me know how you're doing, how are you feeling? That can be a big promoter of individuals speaking up as well. And so I think that can come from individuals who aren't the direct supervisor, where it's just like, how are things going? Like, what kind of ideas do you have? Now, there's a natural learning curve within the organization for new hires. And so there's recent research on, like, with this learning curve is the feasibility. Like, I may have new ideas as an employee, but they may not be feasible in the company because I just don't know all the ins and outs yet. And so I think actually not being a direct supervisor is good, because then they can come to you and bounce those ideas off of, and you can say, hey, that's really good. There may be some runway here. Why don't you kind of speak up to your supervisor about that? So you can be, I think, a positive force as not their direct supervisor to encourage them to speak up with ideas that are feasible and that could have some traction.
I love that. Okay, so here's a little bit of a long one. Ready? How can an organization that might be pivoting their core missions communicate well with the employees who might be negatively impacted by this pivot, especially in this current economic environment? What should the employees do if they're sensing a pivot, but they're not in the know?
This is such a great question, and it's a complicated one. I'm going to give a couple of responses, but I'm going to fear that I don't cover all of the ground. It's interesting because employees identify with different parts of the mission and even come to define themselves as a part of a company that may not continue. We had this situation at the Tippie College of Business. A few years ago, we closed our full-time MBA program. It was the right decision because of the market demand and because there were other things that we wanted to invest in that would serve our stakeholders better. But there were faculty who had spent their whole careers teaching in that program. We're a place that has a lot of swag. So they have the jackets and the mugs and the Tippie MBA everywhere. And when that went away, they felt as though their meaning at work decreased significantly. And it was interesting as I started to learn more about those kinds of changes in organizations to watch the things that helped them deal with that. Part of it has to be, again, a recognition of that is the way people are feeling. There is almost a period of grief or loss that has to be recognized. I hate to go back to celebrations, but I'm a fan, celebrating the impact that that had and making sure that we've sort of recognized that contribution is important. Not everyone knew that news at the same time. And so I think this resonates with the question as well. If leadership shares as much as possible with employees, they're able to cope with that more effectively. They're a part of that process. It's not always possible. And then giving people that opportunity to see how they can connect to another part of the mission. We are no longer doing this, but look at the contribution that you can make here. Leaders making that connection between the employee and another purpose is going to help them then find that next step. That's exactly what I'm studying in this research on when employees feel like their story is over. It's a new chapter.
I love that.
We have 2 minutes and we have 2 questions. I think we could do it. How does management begin to cultivate a more positive and open environment to speak up if people do not currently speak up because of the negative past experiences with management? So how do you kind of cultivate that?
Yeah, because a positive work environment is going to facilitate more voice than a negative one. And so I think accountants use the term like tone from the top, right, with auditing. And so I think the tone from the top really matters. Now, if you can't have, the leaders at the top kind of promoting a positive work environment where people voice, then I think as a leader or influencer, just even within like your own kind of acre of milk and honey, like being able to create an environment where people feel safe within your team. And so I think there's things that you can do on a more micro level, even if maybe the broader organization doesn't quite have it. But I think it starts with kind of the tone from the top. So people who are in positions of influence kind of responding positively to voice and providing kind of opportunities for people to speak up and share their perspectives.
And this is a great question too. So do you have any suggestions for reinvigorating your attitude at your job when the things that used to be fun and challenging and motivating just are not? Any suggestions?
Yes, I have two very specific ones, and I'm going to ask Daniel to reshare our slides if you can while I'm answering this so that we can go to wrap up. I find that the people that I hang out with matter. I had coffee with Nick Westergaard this morning. Nick is a faculty member here at Tippy. He'll be doing a webinar tomorrow on PowerPoint slides, which will be fabulous. Nick and I love to share ideas and bounce things off of each other, and he is one of the most positive people that I hang out with. And so while it's good sometimes to hear about the problems, when I need to be reinvigorated, I try to connect with those people who have a really positive view. I think that makes a huge difference. And then sometimes it's about changing it up. Find that opportunity to paint a fire hydrant, volunteer for a new committee. Sometimes the things, I love everything that I do, but I've done them for a very long time now. And so sometimes it is a new challenge that gets me excited. Yeah, great questions, Ashley. Thank you for helping us move through those well. I did just want to, I'm not being able to click, so I'm going to ask Daniel to help me. Want to share our contact information. Both Daniel and I are on the Tippy website. Here's our email addresses. If you have other questions, or if you were intrigued by a research study that we were doing that you'd like to know more about, please feel free to reach out. We love those opportunities. It is an opportunity for us to find meaning in our work when somebody cares enough to email us.
And to hear your voice. So
yes, so that's good. Here's two more QR codes if you're a QR code person. The Tippy Leadership Collaborative is our external facing arm at the Tippy College of Business, and we do executive and managerial development and education for organizations all over the world, honestly. So if you would like programming to help your leaders become better at encouraging voice or to create more meaningful work, the Tippy Collaborative website, the Leadership Collaborative website is accessible through this QR code, and they would be happy to connect with you. I have recently started a new meaningful part of my job. I'm leading Tippy's social impact community. This is a group of faculty, staff, and students who care about the positive impact that business can have on society. And we are trying to share information that is packaged in ways that is very actionable. One of our main focuses is employee well-being. We think there are a lot of things that organizations can do